the 3. Okay, it's also the 3 weeks, and now Masei begins listing the 42 masos, encampments, trips from one place to another that the Jewish people took in the desert. And really, this is the end of Chumash Bamidbar. And you take a look at Chumash Bamidbar. So what does Chumash Bamidbar talk about? On one hand, it talks about rebellion, and specifically the general focus, although it's not limited to that, is the rebellion of Nasiim, or focus on being a Nasi. Even at the very end, the Nasi of Shevet Shimon tries to start a rebellion, and it also focuses to a large degree on the Jewish people traversing the Midbar, traversing the desert. And since Pasha Shalach begins the encircling, if I could use that word, of the desert, because the Jewish people had exerted a decree against them that they would not be able to enter Israel right away, and they had to spend 40 years in the desert. And the Torah, it goes, say it, the Torah at the end of Masa, which really is the end of the Jewish people traversing the desert. Chumash Dvarim is a repeat, telling over, as is mentioned by the Mefarshim, and adding things. But the end of Chumash Bamidbar really represents, to a certain degree, the end of the traversing of the Midbar, of the desert. And the Torah feels it necessary at the end to list the different places that the Jewish people traveled through the desert. And the question is, why is it that the Torah has to list it? And Rashi says it's to show the praise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how he didn't have the Jewish people just walking through the desert. I think we could suggest to a certain degree that what the Torah is trying to point out to us, that generally when you have many, many different incidents of people doing favor for another person, let's say a parent, when you speak about what a parent does for a child, and you say, he brought him up, that's a generalization. You don't talk about everything that they did in every particular day. You don't talk about the sacrifices that the parent made for the child, whether it was at school, whether it was home, whether it was in the doctor's office. You don't talk about all the details, but there is a tendency to generalize, especially in regard to somebody who is always there, someone who is always almost taken for granted. So the Torah wants to list, you shouldn't generalize and say, Yitzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt. But the Torah is telling us that it's not just the Exodus from Egypt, but the Torah is telling us also that the Torah is telling us that the Exodus from Egypt is a generalized term, or going through the Midbar is a generalized term. But there were 42 encampments, and each encampment had its own miracles. Each encampment showed the Rachmanis that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had for Klal Yisrael. You know, when we have an individual incident, so we remember that. But then when comes the next incident, we forget the previous incident, especially if the second incident was a much bigger incident. A matter of fact, when it comes to remembering the Exodus from Egypt, we have two separate mitzvahs. You have Zikaron Yetzias Mitzrayim, remembering the Exodus, and you have Sibur Yetzias Mitzrayim, the mitzvah of talking about the Exodus, which is only on Pesach night. Zikaron Yetzias Mitzrayim, making quick mention, that's every day of the year and every night of the year. And we say it in the last verse of Kriya Shema. However, the mitzvah of Sibur Yetzias Mitzrayim is to go into detail. We see in the Haggadah we mention that every makkah, every plague that HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought on the Egyptians, some say it was 4 plagues, 5 plagues, whatever it is. In other words, what's the Baal Haggadah trying to emphasize? The Haggadah is trying to emphasize Pesach night. We do not generalize. We go into detail, because if we do not once a year go into detail, we will be covering up the chesed, the kindness that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that God did for the Jewish people. And in a sense, we could perhaps suggest that the two mitzvahs of Zikaron Yetzias Mitzrayim are related to one another. In other words, when Pesach night, it gives us an idea what Yetzias Mitzrayim meant, what the Exodus from Egypt meant. So when we say during the year, Ani Hashem Elokeichem asher hotzeisi eschem eretz Yisrael, I am the God that took you out of the land of Egypt. So orally we generalize, but mentally we understand it's much more than that. And this is the Dayenus. What is the idea behind the Dayenu? If HaKadosh Baruch Hu did this, that would have been in itself a great thing. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu did more than that. What is the idea behind the Dayenu? The idea behind the Dayenu is that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu has this ongoing relationship with Klal Yisrael. Truth is, he has ongoing relationship with all mankind, but he has a special relationship in B'chori Yisrael. He has a special relationship with Klal Yisrael. So it's important not to generalize, because when someone has a constant relationship, an ongoing relationship, every day, there's a tendency to generalize. And when we generalize, we minimize. So because of that, the Masei, when we come to the end of the traversing of the Midbar, the traversing of the desert, it's important to look back and to say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought us from here to there, from there to here. Each trip had its own chesed, had the special caring that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had for Klal Yisrael, for the Jewish people. And we have to be indebted not just for the general approach of taking us through the desert, but for each trip also that we took in the desert. And it's interesting that what I think that it's important as we stand at during these 3 weeks, when the focus is on the exile, on the Golus, it's important that, and this is what Tisha B'av to a large degree is about. You take a look at the Kinnis. So the Kinnis talks not just about Churban Beis Hamikdash. The Kinnis talks not just about the Jewish people going into exile, but included in it was about the Crusades, how the Jews in exile encountered such difficult times when they were massacred. Now, there is a dispute among some of the scholars today as to whether to have a kinnah about the Holocaust. There's no question that the Holocaust is probably the harshest part of our exile. But let's say my uncle, he felt that in order to write a kinnah, a person has to be on a very high level. And his feeling was that we today are not on that level that we can compose a kinnah. But what he did suggest, and he did it himself in his shul, he would draw analogies because his feeling was that many of the forms of torture that were used by the enemies of the Jewish people repeated itself in different forms of shape during the Holocaust. He mentioned, my uncle mentioned that his cousin, my father's cousin also, that him and his wife, they tied them to the Nazis, Yimach Shemam, tied them to the back of a car, and then they raced. They had a race between the two cars. Needless to mention that both were killed. And that's similar to the stories mentioned about the Churban, how they tied they tied Jews to the back of a horse, and then had the horse race. And there were many such incidents that they have similarity. And my uncle would point them out as it was being said. He felt that it is really deserving of a kinnah. He just felt that we aren't on the level to compose the proper kinnah. So what he would do is where a kinnah would mention something that he knew about that had something similar in the Holocaust, when they said the kinnah, he would make mention of it. Now, so when we think about Tisha B'av, it's not enough for us to think about Tisha B'av as the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. But there's so much, and the exile, so much happened throughout the exile. And it's important to focus. It's important to focus on that also, because it's important to see the nature, to realize in detail, because if we don't realize in detail, if we forget what happened, we are going to be off guard. And it's important for the Jewish people when they're in exile to be on constant guard. You know, I was part of the generation that was born shortly after the Holocaust. And I could say that at that time, when I was growing up, Jews were constantly on guard. But I think we're beginning to lose our guard. And we're beginning to have a false sense of security. And it's important that we not let our guard down. We cannot just react to tsaros. We cannot just react to gzeros, to decrees. We have to use whatever ability we have to make sure that these decrees never happen. At one time, Jewish support for the state of Israel. And I'm not talking now about the theological issues. I'm talking about the necessity of the state of Israel as being a place for a Jew to have some sense of security. We have a full sense of security now. And we have this universalistic, as we have this more universalistic approach. Now, I always mention, we have to have a universalistic approach, but our universalistic approach has to emanate from our Judaism, not our Judaism from our universalistic approach. If our Judaism emanates from our universalistic approach, we will not be on guard. And if we learn the lesson of history, in Hazinu it says, "Skor yemos olam, shnina b'nos dor v'dor." It's important for us to remember what has transpired. It's a mitzvah to learn history. Mitzvah is not to learn the dates of history or how a certain king acted. But the lessons of history, we have to learn. Because if we don't learn the lessons of history, we will make ourselves, we will put ourselves in a position of insecurity. Now, and true to a certain degree, this concept of many tragedies plays a role in Tisha B'av. The Gemara says that originally the 4 fast days were enacted: Asara B'Teves, Tzom Gedalia, Shivasa B'Tammuz, and Tisha B'av. They were enacted as required fast days. Required fast days is Bizman Sheyesh Gzeros. At a time there were decrees. I think the original Gersa might have been Bizman Sheyesh Shmad, when people are trying to prevent us from observing our religion. But both are true. But then Klal Yisrael accepted upon themselves to fast Tisha B'av, irregardless of the circumstances. Ultimately, the Jewish people later on accepted the other fast days also. But originally, only Tisha B'av was accepted by the Jewish people, irregardless of the circumstances, whereas the other fast days were accepted only in case of shmad or gzeros, of decrees against the Jew, in time of decrees against the Jewish people. And the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah asks, why is that? And the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says, I could just take the Gemara a second. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says, Shani Tes B'av, 9th of Av, is different. Why? Hoel v'huchbulu botzaros, because there was a lot of sorrows that took place during that time on Tisha B'av. That the tragedies, a lot of tragedies took place at that time. And what 5 tragedies the Gemara lists. The Gemara says, the Tisha B'av, first, well, the Gemara doesn't mention all of them, but the first one, of course, is about the Meraglim, the spies. This has actually happened beforehand. The spies came and gave the false report. And because of that, the people rose in rebellion against Moshe. And as a result of that, they had a bechia shel chinam, as the Gemara says. They had a needless cry. And because of that, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said in the future, on this night, you will have a bechia. You will cry for a reason. That was one thing that happened on Tisha B'av. The second reason and the third reason is the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed and the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. And Nilkada Beitar, Beitar was destroyed. There were thousands upon thousands of people that were killed in Beitar. And V'nechva Sha'ir and Tanisrupas Harasha, he plowed over the city of Jerusalem. These were 5 things. And because of this, originally the Chachamim or the Jewish people instituted that although the original requirement of fasting was only in a time of sorrows, in a time of xeros, in a time of decrees, in a time when Jews are being forced to give up their religion or the practice of their religion. Nevertheless, they accepted upon themselves to fast on Tisha B'av because of huchpulu bot sorrows, because of the amount of sorrows, the amount of tragedies that took place on that day. Now, Tosfos, and here too, we see the idea of huchpulu bot sorrows. It's important to focus not just on one sorrow. Not only that, you see that sometimes we see it in the positive and we see it in the negative also. Sometimes when a person has one tragedy and then another tragedy takes place, he forgets the first tragedy. And we find that in terms of miracles also. The Gemara at the end of Brachos talking about the mitzvah of Zikaron Yetzias Mitzrayim, the mitzvah of remembering the Exodus from Egypt every day and every night. So the Gemara talks about the question as to whether when Mashiach comes, there'll still be a mitzvah of Zikaron Yetzias Mitzrayim, or people at that time will talk about the miracles of Mashiach's coming. Why? Because the general, and the Gemara gives a mashal. The Gemara says sometimes someone comes in contact with an animal that is capable of killing him, and afterwards he talks about the miracle that he survived, and then he comes in contact with a lion. And he survived, then he forgets the first Sarah that he survived. And he talks only about the second and about the third. On a daily basis, that's understandable. You can't talk about everything every day. But a person has to try to remember everything. You should not use one miracle or one tragedy to forget the others. And that's the idea here of huchpulu bot sorrows. In other words, when we think of Tisha B'av, we think of Tisha B'av not just about the Churban Beis HaMikdash, but we think about all the tzaros of Tisha B'av. Now it's very interesting. Tosfos asks a question. Tosfos says the Gemara in Tainus says that there were five tragedies that happened on Tisha B'av. But the Gemara also says that there were 5 tragedies that happened on Shabbos B'Tammuz. First of all, the breaking of the luchos, of the tablets of the Aseres HaDibros, of the 10 Commandments. That happened on Shabbos B'Tammuz. And then Bitul HaTamid, there is a discussion in the Yerushalmi and in the Rishonim, when did this happen? Whether it happened in the time of the Romans, or it happened in the time of the Greeks, or it happened in the time of the Babylonians. But on Shavuos B'Tammuz, at least for a period of time, they were not able to give the carbon tonnet. And then, of course, the city of Yerushalayim was breached, and Apostomus, he was a Greek general, so he burned the Sefer Torah. There is a Matos-Masei that has reference to the Torah of Ezra that was written by Ezra. That was the authoritative Sefer Torah that was kept in the Beis HaMikdash. But there are some that say that he also burnt all the Sifrei Torahs that he could find in Eretz Yisrael. That the Sifrei Torahs were burnt, similar to what happened in France. If we were to draw analogies, where they took all the Shas and all the Gemaras and all the Rambams, and they burnt them also. And then also the Huma Tzalim Beheichel, an idol was placed in the Beis HaMikdash. There's a disagreement what period of time it's talking about. Some say it was Apostomus that did it, and some say it was King Menashe, of the unfortunately king of the Jewish people, that placed the idol in the Beis HaMikdash. So there were 5 tragedies that took place on Shavuos B'Tammuz also. So why is it that the Gemara only emphasizes Huchbalu Botzaros? And why does the Mishnah mention it? The Mishnah mentions it because it's important for us to know. And to a certain degree, we could say that I think my uncle mentions that there is a special halacha about learning about the events and the halachas of the day, and learning about the 5 incidents of Shavuos B'Tammuz. That's also part of that mitzvah. So there is a certain emphasis on Shavuos B'Tammuz, not just about learning about the breaching of the walls, but to learn about the other 4 incidents that took place on that day. So Tosfos asks a question. So there were 5 incidents that took place in Tisha B'av, and there were 5 incidents that took place on Shavuos B'Tammuz. And the Gemara is, so why do we say that originally only Tisha B'av was made a required fast, regardless of the circumstances? Because Huchbalov Tzaros, they had many tzaros on that day. Why doesn't the Gemara say that? Why isn't Shavuos B'Tammuz? Why wasn't Shavuos B'Tammuz also included in that same Zera? Because it was Huchbul Botzaros. Because there were many tragedies that took place on that day. And so Tosfos gives 2 answers. One answer Tosfos gives is because the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash is the greatest tragedy of all. And because of that, the Tisha B'av originally was made as a day of a required fast, irregardless of the circumstances. And so what we have to say, according to Lashon Tosfos, it's very difficult because what's the idea of Chuchpul Botsaros? In other words, we have to see Chuchpul Botsaros. Saros really comes from the word tsar. Trouble. Certain events are more troubling than other events. So no, it's Chuchpul Botsaros. It's talking on a qualitative level, not just on a quantitative level. So it's talking on a qualitative level, not just on a quantitative level. But so that Beis Hamikdash, the fact that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed on a qualitative level, that made it Chuchpul Botsaros. But then Tosfos gives another answer, and Tosfos' answer is because Tisha B'av, the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed twice on the same day. Now, so this answer is difficult according to the Yerushalmi, but because it was destroyed twice on the same day. So the question is, what's the significance that the same tragedy happened twice on the same day, as opposed to other tragedies taking place? What's the idea behind it? Now, in order to understand this, I want to discuss a Gemara in Megillah. The Gemara in Megillah says that Bikesh Rabbi Lakor Tisha B'av. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi wanted to get rid of Tisha B'av. Below Hodulo Chachamim. The Chachamim did not agree with him on that. And the Gemara says, Lo kacha yamaisa. It wasn't that way. But what it was is, it was a year that Tisha B'av fell out on a Shabbos and was postponed to Sunday. So Rabbi felt, since on Sunday anyway, since Sunday wasn't Tisha B'av itself, they shouldn't proclaim the fast on that day. You know, it's that year not to observe Tisha B'av at all, because Shabbos, obviously, you can't observe Tisha B'av, and Sunday isn't Tisha B'av. So because of that, Rabbi felt that year Tisha B'av shouldn't be observed, but not. Rabbi didn't want to get rid of Tisha at all. It's not we couldn't say that. But Tosfos asked the question, what was the Havamin of the Gemara? How did the Gemara even suggest initially that the Rebbe wanted to get rid of Tisha B'av? We know our sages tell us that those who do not fast on Tisha B'av, those who do not mourn the loss of the Beis Hamikdash, so they don't grow b'nechamasa. They don't see in the consolation of Yerushalayim and of the Beis Hamikdash. How is it possible even to have thought that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi wanted to get rid of Tisha B'av? So Tosfos first answers, it's not that he wanted to get rid of Tisha B'av, but he wanted Tisha B'av to become like the other fast days, that you don't fast 24 hours, that you don't have the Chamesh Inuyim, it's just fasting. The Chachamim didn't agree with him. This was what the Gemara initially thought. And then Tosfos gives another answer. And Tosfos says that it's not that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi wanted to get rid of Tisha B'av altogether. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi wanted to change the day of Tisha B'av from the 9th of Av to the 10th of Av. Why? So the Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan said that had he been in the time of the Churban, he would have enacted that Tisha B'av be on the 10th, because the fire that destroyed the Beis Hamikdash was lit shortly before Shkia, shortly before sunset on the 9th. And most of the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed on the 10th of Av. So he would have suggested that the Beis Hamikdash, that Tisha B'av be observed on the 10th. That's what Rabbi Yochanan said. But even Rabbi Yochanan said, had he been there at that time, but Rabbi Yehuda, he wasn't at that time. Rabbi Yochanan was from the younger students of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. But even Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi himself was a little less than 100 years after the second Churban. How could he, after so many years of observance of Tisha B'av, on the 9th of Av, why all of a sudden would he change it to Tes B'av? He admitted that until that time, everybody observed it on the 9th of Av. Why should it be changed specifically at that time? And I was thinking that perhaps this is what the Gemara thought originally. Tisha B'av, and to a certain degree it's true about the other fast days, but somewhat less so. The Tisha B'av has a double theme. On one hand, Tisha B'av is a day of mourning. And the focus, Tisha B'av at night and Shacharis in the morning, is the mourning aspect of Tisha B'av. But Tisha B'av, like the other fast days, is also a form of tzedakah. It's a form of crying out to God for help. The main emphasis in crying out to God for help, that is mincha time, when we lay in Vayichal. And the special tefillas that we say in Shemona Esrei. We're crying out to God for help to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. And it's interesting to we don't do that, but in the time of the Gaonim, the kinnis were coupled with slichos. Kinnis is mourning. Slichos is crying out for help. Now the question is, when is the appropriate time to cry out for help? And when is the appropriate time to mourn? One mourns after someone passed away. There are, unfortunately, people who mourn before that. But when a person becomes sick, you say Tehillim. What's unfortunate is today you have people that mourn before the person dies, and they cry out for help after the person dies. But the proper approach is you don't mourn. You do what you can to help. You cry out for help from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When a person first becomes sick, the mourning takes place after everything, all the attempts were exhausted and the person passes away. That's when you mourn. And to a certain degree, Tisha B'av was both. And the question is, should Tisha B'av be on the 9th or should Tisha B'av be on the 10th? Well, from the perspective of crying out to God, the time to cry out is when the tragedy is first beginning. when the fire was lit, not when the Beis Hamikdash was completely destroyed. Yes, there's what to cry out afterwards. But the more proper time to cry out would have been at the very beginning. And then, but when do we mourn? We mourn after a person dies, when the Beis Hamikdash is completely destroyed. The Beis Hamikdash was completely destroyed on the 10th. Now, initially, after the Churban, the Jewish people faced many decrees against them. So initially, there was a focus, not just on the mourning, but there was a focus on the sorrows that they were facing. There was a focus on the impending danger. The danger that was there every day. But then, the time of Rabbi, when Rabbi became the Nasi, the prince of Klal Yisrael, Rabbi had a very good relationship with Antoninus. Antoninus was Caesar. He was the king of Rome. And so because of that, Rabbi felt that maybe now, of course, Tisha B'av will remain both. It's crying out for help, and it's also mourning. But Rabbi felt that maybe because of the changing circumstances, it's worthwhile to reconsider the situation. Maybe instead of emphasizing the mourning, we should, I should say, instead of emphasizing the crying out for help, because there is no additional immediate danger. Of course, we cry out for help to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. But the situation changed in the sense that each day there was a possibility of additional xeris, additional decrees against the Jewish people, additional Jews being killed, being murdered, Jews being forced to give up their religious practice. But he felt, because of the relationship that he had with Antoninus, perhaps we should emphasize not so much the mourning anymore, to show that there is a difference. We should emphasize the mourning aspect, not the crying out for help, to show the change in the situation. Below Hodel Chachamim, even according to the Habamina, the Chachamim did not agree with Rabbi. The Chachamim felt, well, two things we could say. Either that's the way it was observed till now, that's the way it has to be continued to be observed. Or they felt we still need to cry out for help, because just because one day is better than the previous day, it doesn't mean that the next day will be better. So that was the Havamin of the Gemara. Now, it's very interesting. The Meiri, when he brings down the Tosfos as to why only Tisha B'av initially was a day of a required fast, irregardless of the circumstances, he points out, he says it's true that the walls of Yerushalayim were penetrated in both Batei Mikdash. But in the first Beis Hamikdash, and this is the opinion of the Babli, it was on the 9th of Tammuz, and in the second Beis Hamikdash was on the 17th. Whereas the Beis Hamikdash being destroyed and Av, both of them were destroyed on the 9th of Av. And the question is, so we have to understand what's the idea behind it. Just because both of them happened on the same day, and he apparently didn't understand shehuchbulo bot saros, meaning qualitative as the first answer in Tosfos, but it's quantitative. So why does the Gemara say shehuchbulo bot saros? If it's because of the fact it only had to do with the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, you could interpret shehuchbulo bot saros means that the Beis Hamikdash Kefel was destroyed twice, but the Brisa mentions other things. It doesn't just mention about the Beis Hamikdash being destroyed. The Mishnah mentions other things also. It mentions about the Meraglim. It mentions about Beitar. It mentions about Nechra Sha'ir. So it seems the Huchbul Bot Saros is dealing with all of that. So how are we to understand it? But I think the way we can understand it is the following. You could point probably to many different days in Jewish history. And each day of Jewish history, you could find a number of tragedies that took place on that day. But it wasn't because of that day. That day did not necessarily play a role in the fact that the tragedies took place on that day. However, Tisha B'av is different. Tisha B'av is a day that is identified in halacha as a day when sorrows take place. When it's not just historically, it presents the danger of trouble. My uncle mentioned, why did the Jewish people, according to the Rambam's opinion is that even during the second Beis Hamikdash, they fasted on Tisha B'av, not the other fast days. They fasted on Tisha B'av. And he asked the question, I have a different answer, but he asked the question, why? What were they fasting about? The Beis Hamikdash was there. And he said they were scared that the Beis Hamikdash will be destroyed on Tisha B'av again. So they were fasting that the Beis Hamikdash shouldn't be destroyed this year. Because Tisha B'av is a day that we unfortunately expect trouble. Historically, the expulsion of the Jewish people from Spain. It wasn't just an expulsion that Jewish people had to leave the country, which in itself was a great tragedy. But as a result of going from country to country, in every country they went, they were massacred. So Tisha B'av is a day that became identified with tragedy, not only tragedy that happened, but tragedy that will happen. The day itself. Now, the fact that both Batei Mikdash was destroyed on the 9th of Av. Okay, I bet one Beis Hamikdash could be destroyed, and the second Beis Hamikdash could be destroyed. When you have enemies, that's very likely to happen. Enemies who are enemies of the Jewish people, enemies of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's likely to happen if we are weaker and we put our guard down. We don't act properly. Could even be expected. But it's unusual that both events, the same event, should happen on the same day. So the same event happening on the same day made it clear to the Jewish people that it's not just tragedies that happened on this day, but the nature of the day was part of the cause that the tragedy happened then. And because of this, the more so than the other fasts, Tisha B'av was not just a day that had sorrows on it. It was a day of sorrow. As the Medrash tells us, the Gemara tells us, that when Klal Yisrael had a Bechia Shel Chinam, when they cried unnecessarily, they complained when they shouldn't have complained, when there was nothing to complain about. So God said, on this night, you will have a Bechia for a reason. So Tisha B'av is not just a day that sorrows happen. Shavas B'Tammuz, it could be, but it was never demonstrated that it was because it was Shavas B'Tammuz that these incidents happened. Our responsibility, so because Tisha B'av is a day that brings sorrows, so the Chachamim felt that it's important that the day should, that Tisha B'av, irregardless of the circumstances, should be a day of fasting, of the Chamei Shinuyim, a day of crying out the help of God. And of course, when it's a day for those reasons, it's a day for mourning as well, for the past events as well. But the reason the Chachamim gave special distinction to Tisha B'av, because Tisha B'av, in a sense, is a warning. Watch out. And even in times when there are no gzeros, there were no decrees against the Jewish people, when there is no shmad against the Jewish people, we have to worry when Tisha B'av comes. And in a sense, to a certain degree, Tisha B'av reminds us of our own insecurity. We cannot just say, hey, we don't got to worry. Nothing is happening today. We're always in trouble, and something can always happen. We see the events, the events that take place, the attitudes towards Israel that are changing. Go to the college campuses, and sometimes foolish Jews are leading the protests against Israel. You don't see these foolish Jews demonstrating when terrorists put bombs where there are carriages of little babies. We don't see them demonstrating when terrorists take young children and bang their heads against the walls of caves. You don't see these Jews demonstrating when terrorists go into school buildings. You see them complaining when Israel sends rockets at sites where rockets are being sent against the civilian areas in Israel. Why don't they protest the sending of rockets against the civilian sites in Israel? But they want to show that the universalists, and to show that universalists They have to rid themselves of their Jewish identity. This is Tisha B'av. Tisha B'av reminds us that we are insecure. And Tisha B'av reminds us that we have to cry out to God, even in a time when there are no gzeiros, when there are no decrees. We don't know what tomorrow will bring. After the Holocaust, many in the Jewish community understood it. With the Orthodox, conservative, reform, almost everybody understood it. Today, unfortunately, many people forgot the lesson of history. They forgot the lesson of Zchor Yemos Olam. Tisha B'av, it's not just to mourn the past, but it's to cry out to God to help, to give us help to make sure that these events that took place in our past should no longer take place in our future. Okay.
If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. One question we had was, why don't we have a fast day to commemorate the tragedies that took place during Sfira?
The tragedy that took place in Sfira, that is, well, you're talking about when you say about Sfira, do you mean about the students of Rabbi Akiva, or do you mean about the Xeris of Tach V'Tat?
I don't know if it means crusades, Tach V'Tat.
Yeah, that's okay. If you're talking about the answer is that the one answer is that the Xeros, that it's part of the Golus, and those who say not to have a special day, that everything should be part of Tisha B'av, they'll say because it's part of Tisha B'av. To me, it seems, I always mention this, the question is about whether there should be a fast, not a fast day or a day of mourning or whatever you want to call it, for the Holocaust. And certainly a day of education is very important for the Holocaust. Two things I'll say. First of all, if we had a special day of fasting for the day, on days that there was tragedies, I don't think there'll be a day that we could eat. That's one thing. Secondly, the tragedy, it's, let's say, if he's talking about Rabbi Akiva's, so I think I'm actually in favor of some type of observance of Yom HaShoah. However, my feeling is that ideally Yom HaShoah should be included in Tisha B'av, but we have to deal with reality, and reality is that most of the Jewish public, at one time I would say this even about the Orthodox, that has changed to a certain degree in the Orthodox community. But listen, when I went to shul as a boy, no one mentioned the Holocaust on Tisha B'av. No one mentioned the Holocaust on Tisha B'av. So the Holocaust was not seen. Unfortunately, it was not seen as part of the Golus, as a tragedy of the Golus. It certainly was part of the Golus. So the hope was that if through the observance of Yom HaShoah, people will recognize the tragedy of the Shoah, they'll also come to recognize the tragedy of Golus. And to a large degree, that was accomplished in the Orthodox community. Less so, and I'm not saying completely, less so in the other communities. You see that lots of people go now, Tisha B'av, to visit Holocaust museums, because the Holocaust has become part of the perspective of exile. So it's something that is associated with Tisha B'av. When I was a boy, it wasn't that way. It wasn't that way. And so it seems to me, with what in the previous years, let's say in the time of the Sphira, and in time of whether or the Tachtatat or that, those things in those times was recognized by the Jewish public as part of exile. But so because of that, they didn't have to make a special day to commemorate those events, because people recognize that as part of the exile. Unfortunately, what happened is, and this is what I was speaking about, that people began to see Tisha B'av from a very narrow perspective. And this idea of Huchbelu Botsaros somehow disappeared from their mind. And instead of Huchbelu Botsaros, it was just the Churban, the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. They didn't even talk about exile. They focused it only about the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. And of course, Tisha B'av is much more than that. Now, to a certain degree, that has changed in recent years. But I remember years when they had a very narrow perspective of Tisha B'av. I would suggest that it's because of the opposition of many in the Orthodox community to Yom HaShoah that they realized they had to emphasize the Shoah in regard to Tisha B'av. Whatever it is, it was an accomplishment of Yom HaShoah that today people recognize the Shoah as part of the exile and that it's part of Tisha B'av. Okay.
Any other questions? Someone's saying, I don't know if this is saying that it's a Churban itself, that the Illinois Holocaust Museum makes the Holocaust a universalistic perspective and not a unique Jewish tragedy.
I understand that problem. And the only thing I'll say is that it's better that the tragedy of the Holocaust be recognized as a humanistic tragedy than not see it at all. And unfortunately, it could be even worse than that. And they're 100% correct. The tragedy of the Holocaust was something altogether different. Many years ago, Mr. Kirsch wrote a very good article. I think it was published in the Sentinel, I'm not sure. He wrote a letter where he said that he was a survivor, and he wrote an article in which he emphasized the uniqueness of the Holocaust. He says there's no question there were great tragedies that took place, but this was something altogether different. And he went on to explain how, and I'm not even talking from a religious perspective, how it was altogether different. They just killed people because they were Jewish. They didn't kill them because they wanted power, because they feared the Jews would have power or anything of that sort.
Okay, there aren't any other questions, so thank you very much.
Okay.
Next week we'll have
yeah, and then we'll see what about the
Tisha B'av.
whether we'll have a share before Tisha B'av. Okay, I'll be in touch then.
Okay.
Okay.